And what I'm going to do first is something I did last week, and somebody told me that's not a bad idea, is review what we've gone over before. Except this time I'm doing it for another purpose. I want you to think about one thing as we go through this review, and that is that we're looking at a story, a very well-plotted story. What I'm going to tell you at the end of this is that this story actually is 3 different stories that were put together, and we want to talk about how that came about to get such a story. But let's very quickly take a look at what we have in this very short review. The fact that we have this father, Jacob, with a favorite son, Joseph, his 11th son, he has 10 other sons. This younger son likes to enthrall his brothers with tales about dreams that he has had, and they dislike him so much they decided to do away with him. And what we find is that one of his brothers, Reuben, has him hidden in a well, hoping to rescue him a little bit later. But then what happens, they pulled him out of the well, and he was sold to these traders, these Ishmaelite traders. And these Ishmaelite traders took him to Egypt. Ishmaelite, or were they Median? Well, we'll talk about that later. What they did is they took the robe of that favorite son, dipped it in some blood of some animal, and took it to their father Jacob and said, look, this is what happened to your son. He was killed by an animal. Joseph, in the meantime, is sold to Potiphar, who was an Egyptian official, and he becomes very important in Potiphar's family, but Potiphar's wife immediately takes a notice of him, and she tries to seduce him. She doesn't succeed, but she does succeed in lying about him and having him accused of trying to seduce her. As a consequence, he is thrown into prison. And when he's in prison, he encounters a couple of guards, or a couple of prisoners, both of whom have dreams, and he interprets these dreams for these 2 prisoners. One of the prisoners dreams about baskets of bread, and the other one vines of fruit. And one of these is the butler of the king, and the other is the baker of the king. The butler of the king is told that his dream means that he's going to be restored to this position as butler or wine taster for the king. On the other hand, the baker is told that because of the fact the birds are eating the fruit from his baskets, he is going to be executed in 3 days. And sure enough, these things happen. What the Bible says here is kind of interesting, is that the butler remembered what Joseph had done, but it took him 2 years to remember it. And Joseph sat in prison for another 2 years, when it happened that the Pharaoh at that time had a dream. She had a couple of dreams, and the dreams are up here. And I think the other dreams a little bit further. He dreams about fat cattle and lean cattle, and the lean cattle gobbling up the fat cattle, stalks of grain, healthy grain, and bad grain. And the butler remembers the fact that this man that he had in prison was able to interpret dreams, calls for Joseph to come and interpret the dreams. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams, indicating that there are going to be 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph, that's Joseph here, makes the pronouncement that Pharaoh ought to appoint somebody to see to it that during those 7 years things are taken care of. Immediately, this Pharaoh says, yes, that's a good idea, and I'm going to appoint you. And Joseph suddenly becomes a very powerful man in Egypt. Here he's been given the ring of the Pharaoh. He's allowed to ride around in a chariot. He's given a bride. She actually is a princess. She was a daughter of a priest. And Joseph does take charge of seeing to it that grain is stored for them for 7 years of plenty. He also, with the bride, has 2 children, Ephraim and Manasseh, and they play important roles later on. The famine does come, and after the famine has been there a couple of years, Jacob, back in Canaan, talks to his sons and says, "We better go to Egypt." Apparently they have food in Egypt, and pick up some food there. Now, what those brothers don't know is that this brother that they sold into slavery actually is alive, and it is Joseph. But they do not know it's Joseph. Joseph immediately recognizes his brothers when they come there, but does not reveal himself to them. He plays them. And you might say, okay, it's a kind of a revenge that he's going to be getting on them. And what he does when they are leaving with the grain is he puts all the money that they have spent to get the grain into their sacks so that they can be accused of stealing that money. When they discover the money, they're very alarmed. They tell their father what had happened, and their father says, you've got to get that money back. But they said, we can't go back, because when they were with Joseph, Joseph found out that he had a brother. Now, apparently that brother was born before Joseph was taken before he was kidnapped. But he finds out his brother is still alive, and Jacob is told, go back to Egypt. And they say, we can't go back to Egypt unless we take our brother Benjamin along. So they take Benjamin along back to Egypt, and they encounter this vice chancellor. They encounter Joseph again. And one of the interesting episodes is they are seated at a table. They have a dinner with Joseph, and they find out that they are seated at the table according to their age, which mystifies Joseph a little bit. How in the world would he know the age of all these people? He also has the opportunity here of dining with them. When they are about to leave, Joseph pulls another interesting trick. Let's not only give them back their money, but take the silver cup from my table and put it in the bag of, guess whom? Of that younger brother Benjamin. And when they are looking for that silver cup, the brothers have already said, we did not steal it, and anybody who stole it, do what you wanted with it. They find the cup, and it turns out to be in Benjamin's sack. A couple of very interesting pictures of that. Here we find Judah pleading with Joseph, don't do anything to our brother, do it to me. Don't let anything happen to me. Even more pleading, to the point that Joseph cannot take it any longer, leaves the room weeping, and turns right around and comes back and reveals to his brother that he is their brother Joseph, the one they sold into captivity. And then there are a bunch of nice pictures of the rejoicing of the people getting together again. Great time. Many, many pictures of that. Now, like I said, does that sound like one story? Yes, very nicely a single story. The interesting thing about it is actually it was made up of 3 different stories, and we'll talk more about that later on, about the artistic or literary art that went into putting this together. When I went back over this material and got to chapter 46, after the chapters 37 through 45 are pretty much centered on Joseph. The one exception I should mention, because we're going to talk about it sometime later this year, chapter 38 is all about Judah, has nothing at all about Joseph, but just a very interesting chapter about Judah, just loaded with sex, so we'll get to it another time. But the last 5 chapters really are not about Joseph. Actually, one of the commentaries points out the last chapters go back to another hero among the patriarchs, namely Jacob. And they're pretty much centered on Jacob. The fact that when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, tells them, is my father still alive? Bring my father here. Pharaoh says, yes, bring your father here. And what we find now in chapter 46, the start of the journey of Jacob with his family, who were living in Hebron at that time, go to Beersheba, and then travel all the way into Egypt. Now that chapter is very interesting to read. I wouldn't read it to you because guess what it is? One name after another name, and what they do is they list all of the people that went to Egypt at that time. Not only is it repetitive, it's also very difficult to pronounce, and it is rather boring. But near the end of that chapter, something kind of interesting comes out. Oh, here are some pictures of the travel of Jacob and his family going to Egypt. The carts and everything were furnished by Pharaoh. And there are a lot of pictures of that. One of the things that happens is that Jacob does see his son Joseph again. He thought Joseph had been dead all these years, and Jacob and Joseph are reunited. And then come a couple of very curious things, and that is they start to number the people that went to Egypt. And if you read this very carefully, it will, after listing all these names, say there are 66 people that go to Egypt in that family. In other words, Jacob's family is number 66, and that's not counting some of the wives, 66. But then they mention that Joseph also has two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, that I mentioned a moment ago. So 66 plus the 2 makes what? 70. Because that's what it says in the next verse. The 70 went. I looked into this and found out that very likely what had happened is some redactor or scribe had gotten hold of some census material and put in a number. And there was another place where I saw one time that there was 72 of them went back. We don't know how many went back, but keep this in mind. This is what? This is Jacob's family. This is not Israel. Israel is not a nation yet. As a matter of fact, when we look at the book of Genesis, it is just exactly what it says in that name. What does that name mean? It means origin or the beginning. It's the beginning of the story of what? Of the nation of Israel. That nation does not come about until when? Until Moses and the burning bush, hundreds of years later on. Up until that time, they are just a family. They're just a family of Jacob, family of one of the 3 patriarchs. Actually, all that we have about the person in Genesis is things about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Quite a bit on Jacob, quite a bit on Abraham, very little on Isaac. Isaac sometimes is described as sort of a shadow figure, and there is not that much about him. But there is a lot about Jacob. And what we have in these last 5 books of Genesis is sort of summing up this whole business in a very interesting fashion with Jacob, who is in a sense a principal character in the rest of the book. There's another thing that I find rather interesting, and that is that when we take a look at the book of Genesis very carefully, we find out that the first 10 chapters deal with the olden times prior to the time of the Tower of Babel, after the flood. After the Tower of Babel, we get a great big long list of the heritage of a man called Terah. Terah was a Semite. He was a direct descendant of Shem. Actually, his lineage is traced back almost 10,000 years. They don't have every name in there correctly. But for 10,000 years, his family has been a leading family where? In Upper Mesopotamia, over on the other side, over on the east side of the Fertile Crescent. And finally, we get to a story involving that family. And Terah comes to life. And what's the first thing that we read about Terah after having his family live for 10,000 years in Upper Mesopotamia? Terah says, we're going to move. And that's what we find kind of interesting in the book of Genesis, is there's constant moving. And what we find is that the Bible itself does not tell us directly what brought about these moves. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, and that is that the moves that they made out of Mesopotamia into Haran and to Canaan were caused by political problems and were caused by an economic situation where people like Terah and his family who were nomadic shepherds, nomadic herdsmen, were finding it difficult to live in Upper Mesopotamia because as the population of Mesopotamia grew, more and more of the pasture land was being taken up for tillage to raise grain. So we find that there was a reason for Terah and his family moving out of Mesopotamia into Canaan. Now what we found in the story of Joseph, a rather interesting thing, and that is that all of a sudden, after being in the patriarchs being in Canaan for some decades, they moved to Africa. Now how did that come about? Well, remember a couple weeks ago we talked about the fact that there were some things that were happening in that part of the world as far as secular history was concerned. And one of them was that a good part of Egypt, namely the upper part near the delta, near the Mediterranean, was being taken over by what they call the Hyksos. The Hyksos were shepherd kings, or foreign kings. Actually, there's every indication that they were Semitic people that very likely may have come from Canaan. When we put that together with Joseph being sold into slavery and brought to Egypt, that he encounters the Pharaoh in Egypt who happens to be a Semitic, and they hit it off pretty well. And it's not too surprising then that we find that Joseph could be appointed to become the vice chancellor, you might say. Again, secular history played a rather important role in determining the move that was made. But the significant thing is that these people have gone all the way from Upper Mesopotamia to Haran, to Canaan, and now to Africa. Why is that so important? If you go to the book of Exodus, when they do become a nation, one of the places where it's stated very, very succinctly how important it was is being a nation is when we take a look at the preamble to the Ten Commandments. When God says to them what? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of bondage out of Egypt. That is one of the precepts as far as the Israelite nation is concerned. They had come from Egypt. The book of Genesis then has to find a way of getting these people from Mesopotamia to Canaan and into Egypt so that they can do what? They can leave Egypt and come to the promised land and come back to Canaan. The next chapters that we're going to be looking at are chapters dealing with that migration of these people from Egypt into the promised land. And that is the stories of Moses in the desert. But let's take a look a little bit more at this, this chapter 46. There's another meeting of Jacob and Joseph. Very important, significant meeting. In chapter, excuse me. Chapter 46, we start to see the groundwork being laid where Jacob's family is going to be for the next couple hundred years. Because at the end of chapter 46, Joseph becomes aware of the fact that this family's got to live somewhere. Where are they going to live and be comfortable? Because they are shepherds. They said, when you get a chance to find out and talk with Pharaoh, that is the man who's the leader, let him know that you're shepherds, and see if you can't go to the land of Goshen. I talked a little bit about this last week. The land of Goshen was in that upper part of, I think I have a map of that. No. Does that? No, it doesn't show. That was Jacob in the previous one. Jacob pleading with Pharaoh, let us go to Goshen. Here's Jacob again pleading with Pharaoh. That's the man that's in charge, not Joseph. Let us go to Goshen. Why go to Goshen? Because apparently the Egyptians do not like shepherds. And Goshen was a part of that delta. It was a part of the eastern part of the delta. And apparently, for some reason, the Egyptians did not feel that strongly about Goshen. I can't quite understand why, unless it was just a matter of habit. The Egyptians' whole existence depended on the Nile River, and the fact that the Nile River went right through a desert and furnished water, and in furnishing water did what? Made it capable for raising or tilling the soil to raise crops. They felt very strongly about that. They did not like sheep, because sheep take a lot of room and they eat anything that's growing, and they don't leave the land available to be raising crops. And so just as soon as not, get those shepherds out of the way and let them go to Goshen. I found another place, and I saw another place and never found it again, where it said another reason they didn't like the sheep is because sheep will bite down so far they'll get almost to the roots of the vegetable, and you can't raise anything there again. The Egyptians did not like shepherds. And Terah's family, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were all what? Very much involved in herding. The rest of that chapter, what we find is also very interesting, and that is that after the Israelites, after Jacob's family is settled in Goshen, we run into a situation where Joseph sort of gets in charge of seeing to it that people are taken care of in Egypt also because of the famine. And what we find in a couple of verses that are rather interesting in terms of the fact that it became Joseph who saw to it that the people in Egypt who were starving at that time were also being fed in terms of their cattle, which cattle they had, and also made it a law that all the land be turned over to the Pharaoh. To the Pharaoh, and that they would be paying a fifth of everything to Pharaoh. That is sort of establishing what the situation was in Goshen in terms of Israel, in terms of Jacob's family. The next 3 chapters are really quite different. They deal with something very significant, and that is the fact that these are the last days of Jacob. If you take a look at the book of Genesis very carefully, you realize that the story of Joseph is unique because it has a great plot. But you want to talk about a great plot, you want to take a look at the story of Jacob. Jacob starts out in Canaan in a situation with his brother Esau, where he steals his brother Esau's birthright, and he flees all the way up to Haran. He spends time in Haran. Over 20 years, marries 2 women who were his cousins, and takes on 2 concubines, has 11 sons and at least 1 daughter that we know of, before he has to come back into Canaan. And he comes back into Canaan. There are things that apparently took place when he came back to Canaan. We talked about those in the past, the situation. I think I might mention that in a moment again. Certain things that happened in Canaan that indicate that Jacob had a very full life. Now, all of a sudden, where do we find Jacob? We find Jacob down where? In Egypt, another part of it. And he is in his latter years. Here we have a situation of Jacob and Joseph. And what Jacob is saying to Joseph in this situation here, in this chapter, I think this is still in chapter 46, it's 47. When I die, don't bury me here. Bury me back in Canaan. Bury me in the promised land. And Joseph makes that promise, as you'll see, becomes rather significant. The other thing that happens is that Jacob, getting old, recognizes Joseph's sons. Now keep in mind, Joseph's sons are Egyptian, and they're half Semitic. His wife was an Egyptian princess or the daughter of an Egyptian priest. These 2 sons are Ephraim and Manasseh. What Jacob does make clear to Joseph that you are again my son, but you are still a favored son, and you are going to get a double portion of what my other sons get. And near the end of Jacob's life, he wants to pass the blessing on to the sons of Joseph. And here we have the picture of Jacob passing on the blessing to the sons of Joseph. What is the one thing you notice about the hands? They're crossed. Ephraim was not the eldest. Ephraim was the second. Manasseh was the older of the 2 sons. By birthright, guess what? The birthright should go to Manasseh. just as the birthright should have gone to Esau, but it went to Jacob. What we're finding here is that Jacob also is passing the birthright not to Manasseh, but passing it to Ephraim. That is his right hand, yeah. Because he said, in time you will find that Ephraim is going to be the predominant of these two tribes. Actually, not the predominant of those two tribes, but the predominant of the 12 tribes. Here, you know, I mentioned this before. Excuse me. I mentioned this before, and that is that the artists like to find some pictures where there's some action. You can find any number of pictures of Jacob crossing his hands to give this blessing, because at least he's doing something more than just sitting in a chair. So in that particular chapter, we get that rather significant blessing. Here is a picture of Ephraim. Here is Judah. Judah has the tribe of Simeon. I'll talk a little bit in a moment about that. But these are the other 10 tribes, and they are eventually going to be Israel. They're going to be the 12 tribes of Israel. Here's Ephraim. You notice that Ephraim is very close to Jerusalem. Manasseh has very large sections. This whole section here we know nothing about in the Old Testament, other than the fact that Jacob did make mention at one time that he fought a battle on this side to get this territory. And so Manasseh has all this territory. But this is Israel, and these are the tribes of Israel, the 10 tribes. You notice here that Reuben is one of the tribes of Israel here also. I want to mix that a little later. When we get to the next chapter, chapter 49, we get Jacob blessing his sons. Now here it is abbreviated. I found a great slide that tells us just about everything that's in that chapter. But one of the most significant things that comes in that chapter is again this situation where the birthright does not go to the eldest son. When we take a look at Jacob's children, when we back up in Haran, his wife Leah immediately has 4 sons. The oldest of these sons is Reuben. Reuben is followed by Simeon and Levi, and the youngest of these 4 sons is Judah. What we're told in this blessing that Jacob gives to his sons, why Judah is going to become the predominant tribe in the south. Not Reuben, and not Simeon, and not Levi. Why? Well, these are stories that we already have given to us in the book of Genesis. Reuben should by all rights be what? Be the one that gets the birthright. Would be the one that inherits the opportunity to carry on the lineage. But he doesn't get it. Just one very brief verse, and it's worth talking about because people do make too much of it sometimes. When they are back in Canaan, Jacob has one more son with Rachel, his favorite wife. That son is Benjamin. And almost immediately we're told that Rachel died. And that is followed by a couple of verses that say, and then Reuben went into the tent of Bilhah, who was Rachel's maid, and had sex with her. And because he had defiled his father's concubine, he is therefore thrown off. There's a little bit more to it than that. What Reuben was doing here was asserting his position as being the oldest son. If Rachel had died and Jacob was old, they were going to probably do no more children. Why don't I take charge right now? And in going into Bilhah and having sex with her was not a matter of carnal lust. This was a matter of trying to establish himself as, look at me as the leader. And what we are told here is that was not looked on kindly by Jacob, and all of a sudden his eldest son is persona non grata. Reuben doesn't get very much further. The next 2 sons are Simeon and Levi. They're dishonored. Why? If you remember the story when they were living in the region of Shechem, that Dinah the sister of Reuben and of Levi and Judah and Simeon, was raped by the prince of Shechem. Then this prince of Shechem said, no, I love her, I want to marry her, let me marry her, and pleased with the opportunity to be able to marry her. Jacob's brothers, then Jacob's sons, Levi and Simeon in particular, say, now just a second, we're not going to let our daughter, our sister, marry this guy from Shechem. He's not one of the circumcised like we are. He said, you can marry her if all the males in your city will also be circumcised. And they said, fine. And we had that rather interesting story about all the males in Shechem were circumcised in one day, and the next day Simeon and Levi, and it says while they were still hurting in Shechem, slaughtered the city. What Jacob has to say in one of the translations is that you have made my name stink in this area. It makes me look rather poor. So all of a sudden we find Reuben and Levi and Simeon not being in succession, but who is left? Judah, the youngest of the four. He becomes the next. Zebulun and Issachar are also sons of Levi, sons of Leah. So there were all these as the children of Leah. Here are the ones that come from Rachel, and these other four are the ones that come from those handmaidens, from Zilpah and Hildah, Naphtali, Asher, Gad, and Dan. We don't read very much about any of these. Little bit shows up. One of these says something about boats. Oh yeah, where is that? Oh yeah, oh Asher. One of these says something about boats. I thought maybe in the Bible it does, and indicating that where these tribes came from, how they ended up there. Well, what we're told in the story that we have in Genesis is that they were foretold this is where they would end up when they all would go with their families generations later back into Canaan. Here one of the pictures of Jacob blessing these sons, the various sons, and then Jacob dies. But Jacob had asked Joseph to do what? See to it that I'm buried in Canaan. And chapter 50 does a very interesting thing and shows us something about the effort that were made by Pharaoh to see to it that Jacob's wish is fulfilled and that he is buried in Canaan. And so there is a great, big, long funeral procession going all the way from Egypt, all the way back into Canaan, so that he can be buried where? In the cave where what? Where Abraham and Sarah were buried. In the cave where Rebekah and Isaac were buried. And also where his wife, his first wife Leah, was buried. He wants to be buried with his family. That cave at Machpelah becomes a very important shrine as far as the Israelites are concerned. Here's a picture of the cave today. You see, it's no longer a cave. It's one of the main attractions as far as the Hebrew religion is concerned that you will find anywhere in Palestine. It's very near Hebron. Great big mammoth building. I think I have another picture which is equally interesting. Here's the picture of the interior of this building. And if you read the legend here, we can find out just exactly where Jacob was buried, where Isaac and Rebekah were buried, and Sarah and Abraham were buried. The reason I put this in here, is there any chance that anybody here has been there? Because once in a while, some people have seen this. It is, as far as the Jews are concerned, this is one of the main attractions when you go to Israel. The other thing that happens here that is rather significant is that Joseph has died. And we find out that Joseph does live on past the burial of Jacob until he's about 110 years old. But he makes a rather interesting request. You can embalm me here in Egypt, but bury me in Canaan. And we find out when we get to the book of Exodus that when Moses is leaving Egypt with the Israelites, what did they take along with them? The bones of Joseph, so that he can be buried in his homeland, buried in Canaan. Now, that's about as much as that we're going to say about the book of Genesis, except that I do find it interesting in that, in a sense, it does fulfill that name. It tells us about the beginning, about something that had happened centuries before the Israelites actually became a nation. Would this occur? When did most of these things happen? Awful lot of guessing. They can get pretty good guesses as to when the Hyksos were in power in Egypt, and it would be around 1500. So we'd say that the story that we have of Joseph and the stories that we've just been looking at involving Israel, involving Jacob and his family, were around 1500. When did Moses go with the Israelites from Egypt back to Canaan? Again, there's a lot of guessing on this. We're going to talk about that a lot more later on. But it's going to be about 300 or 400 years later. Maybe 300 years, maybe 400 years. There's another thing that I find kind of interesting. And that is that in the book of in the book of Exodus, it tells us that when Moses left Egypt, he took along with him 600,000 men, not counting their wives and families, as part of the group that migrated out of Egypt. 600,000. In other words, probably close to 2 million people. You've heard me say this many times before, and I'll say it again. There's absolutely no evidence that that actually happened. There's no evidence that 2 million people were in the desert for 40 years following Moses. We don't know exactly what did happen. But what is interesting about that statement is that if Jacob's family had moved in there, a total of maybe about 70 people, they had grown into a fairly large number. And it isn't out of the question at all that it could have been as much as 600,000 people. I try to find I know I would know how to program this in old-fashioned Fortran. Does anybody remember Fortran along with hieroglyphics and stuff like that? If each of these sons, these sons, that are mentioned here, and their family, if they had, each of them had 2 children, and each of those children had 2 children, and each of those, it doesn't take too many generations before you're to how many people? Thousands of people. Thousands. Does anybody recognize something that's, well, I'm sure you know. That's the way the atomic bomb works too. You've heard of the atomic bomb. Mm-hmm. It depends on, this is a very, very, very sketchy thing, probably not accurate, somebody may correct me on. But what happens is that a neutron hits uranium-235, splits it up into 2 small units, 2 small elements. Part of the mass that the uranium-235 is lost, and it's converted into energy. That's the bomb. But you know what else happens? It generates 2 neutrons, which hit 2 others, and in a matter of milliseconds, you got millions of neutrons hitting uranium-235, and you're getting a atomic. Same sort of thing happened here. It's not too surprising that Jacob's family may have been only about 70 people that moved in there, but in a matter of a couple hundred years, there could be a lot of people, very many people. That makes the book of Genesis rather real, because what it does is say, this is the beginning, this is the origin. Now we're going to get into what happened some hundreds of years later. What do we know about what happened in those 100 years between Joseph and Moses? Nothing. We just have to suppose what might have happened. But when we get to Exodus, we'll learn a lot more about it. Now, some of you saw what I had on the next slide. The word documentary hypothesis. When I went through that review, that very quick review with you, I asked you to think about one thing. You're hearing a story, but it actually is a combination of 3 stories. Remember when we were looking at some of the things involving the story that we had, that there were discrepancies. For example, we find out when the brothers were unhappy with Joseph, the brothers were unhappy. One of the brothers, Reuben, takes Joseph and hides him in a well. He says, I'll go back and I'll get him later on and rescue him and not let him be killed. In the meantime, what had happened is that the other brothers had pulled Joseph out of the well and sold him to the Ishmaelites. Or was the Midianites? Well, there's both places. I'll get back to it in a second. Later on, we find out that another brother, Judah, wants to rescue Joseph, who he's put in the well. No, he didn't put him in the well. Reuben put him in the well. Remember? We get a change of names here. We get a situation that Joseph is sold to traveling Ishmaelites. And then all of a sudden, almost in the same verse, and I probably will show you that sometime later, the Ishmaelites become Midianites. The Midianites and Ishmaelites are not the same people. These are the sort of things that people had noticed about the time of the Renaissance. From the time that the Old Testament had been available, around 200, well, actually around 300 or 400 BC, that he had a good part of the Old Testament was available for people to read. People just took things as they were written and didn't question them at all. With the Renaissance, people started to look at some of the things that were in the Old Testament and question, hey, wait a minute, how could Moses, as we are told from the way we believe the Bible, that everything in the Bible is correct and no changes, how could Moses have written about his own death? And some of them might have started wondering, why the Ishmaelites here and the Midianites over here? Why Reuben here and Judah later on? What's going on here? As early as the 1700s, there were people that were recognizing that very likely what we have in the book of Genesis, as well as in some of the other books, is that there's more than one book, there's more than one being put together into a single book. They're called the sources. This source led to the documentary hypothesis. Sometime I may go through the history of how the documentary hypothesis was formulated, but right now I'd like to take a look at those 2 words and what they really do mean. A hypothesis is a supposition or a proposed explanation made on the basis of limited evidence as a starting point for further investigation. The documentary hypothesis is not a law. It's a proposed explanation as to why things are the way they are. Do we make use of hypotheses? Well, if you're involved in research, an awful lot of research is what? Based on hypotheses. If such and such is possibly true, then this would be true, and we try to do this sort of. We are using hypotheses all the time. I was thinking about an interesting hypothesis. An interesting hypothesis is that going through a busy thoroughfare, a busy metropolitan area, and obeying absolutely none of the traffic signals, you might have an accident. You can test that one. How? Let somebody try it and see what happens. That's using a hypothesis. What is a document? A document is anything that is written down. Now this becomes significant. When we talk about the documentary hypothesis, we're talking about the fact that apparently there were things that had been written down and had been made available as writing that could be put together to explain what we have when we look at the Bible itself. Actually, it's somewhat limited in when we look at the documentary hypothesis. We find out that there are actually only about 4 books that are actually mentioned in the part of the Bible that we're interested in, namely the Torah. The documentary hypothesis applies only to the Torah. And what are the Torah? The Torah are the 5 books of Moses. The Torah are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Sometimes in the books of law. And we find that these documents are found only in those books that we can really ascribe some ownership to. What are they? They're called the Yahwehs, which is designated by the letter J. And I'd like to explain that. The reason that is most of this work on the documentary hypothesis was done by the Germans. And the Germans do not have the use of the letter Y. And so they talk about Yahwehs. Not Yahwehs, but Yahwehs. And the Yahwehs law document became known as the J document. Then there's an Elohist document, a priestly document, and then a Deuteronomy document. Now, what's interesting about this is that this gets simplified very quickly when we find out something, that the Torah is made up of contributions from J and E, and from P, the priestly document, and from the Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, a little bit of it shows up, well, the whole book of Deuteronomy shows up, but Deuteronomy stands out by itself. And when we talk about the documentary hypothesis, we don't spend any time talking at all about the book of Deuteronomy. Why is that? Because the book of Deuteronomy by itself is very interesting. And we'll talk about it sometime probably later next spring when we're talking about Jeremiah, about the significance of the book of Deuteronomy in the history of the Israelites. On the other hand, it's interesting to take a look at this part of this little diagram. J, the Yahwehs, and the Elohist, both are stories. They're stories that are in many times very similar. And what we find in the Old Testament is an indication that J and E are put together into stories, which we call the Yahweh's Elohist stories. What stories? The ones that we've been talking about. The ones that are interesting, the stories of Joseph, the stories of Jacob, the stories of Abraham and Isaac and all these other things. Stories about these people. Very, very significant part of the history of the Israelites are what are in these stories. They go into the Torah. They go into the 5 books. From J and E comes the priestly documents. Now, I'm going to be talking a lot more about these later on this year. The priestly documents were made long after the J and E, or the Yahwist and the Elohists, were put together in forming these stories. Who wrote the priestly documents? Can you guess? The priests. And they said, look, we don't need all this stuff about these people having all these different incidents in their lives. We got to talk about the things that are significant to us as priests. And what's that? The temple, the sacrifices, and the holidays, the religion. Leave all this other stuff out. And they wrote the whole thing again, but left out all the interesting stories. I think I have a slide a little bit later on that points out something rather interesting. When we go through through the Old Testament here, go through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, we find out there's far more from the priestly document than there is from the other 2. Far more. They saw to it that somebody did point out, and I'm quoting this, and that the priestly document stands by itself. You do not need the Yahwist and the Elohists. You do not need these stories. But I'm quoting them. But it reads as dry as bones. It's not interesting. It becomes interesting when the Yahwist and the Elohist parts are put into it as well. Then we get to something that's a little bit more substantial, namely the Torah. But notice here on the side, R. What is R? R means redactor. Redactor is, what's another name for that? Editor. That these books were edited. Somebody edited these books before they actually got into the Torah. And what we have in the Torah are the edited books that we have of J and E, the edited books of, the priestly document, and edited books of the Deuteronomic source. That gives us the Torah. The significance of this R cannot be overestimated. It probably is one of the more interesting things that I have found in looking into this documentary hypothesis, is the significance of the role of the editors. My time is almost up, and I just want to say, well, let me see what the next slide is here. I may have it. One of the ways of dividing the Bible then that becomes rather significant is to look at the Pentateuch. Those are those 5 books. That's the Torah. But as far as what we have in terms of the documentary hypothesis is the Tetrarch, namely Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. They don't have anything in the Deuteronomy canon. But what about Deuteronomy? Deuteronomy belongs itself. As a matter of fact, this was noted very early on during the period of enlightenment when this documentary hypothesis was being put together, is that Deuteronomy sort of stands by itself different from the other 4 books, but is very much like what? Very much like what we find in the writing of Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings. In other words, they say we shouldn't divide this in terms of 5 and then the Deuteronomic histories. In terms of the 4, the Tetrarch, and then the Heptateuch. The 7 books that involve the first of the books, the Deuteronomic histories, would be the book of Deuteronomy itself, which is also part of the Torah. And for that reason, we're going to be looking, when we look at the documentary hypothesis, not at these Deuteronomic histories, but later on, when these Deuteronomic histories may have been written. You may recall that I mentioned, I think about a year ago, and that is that there is some indication we might know who actually wrote some of these books, like Samuel and Kings, where they came from. Let's see what we have here. Okay, just one little bit of a brief background on these documentary hypotheses. We're going to talk a lot more about them next week. The Yahweh Source is the oldest. And we think it probably was written about the time of King Solomon, maybe a little bit earlier than that. That probably is not too surprising, because one of the things that we learn about Solomon is that he had gathered around him a lot of very learned people. And Solomon's court was noted as being a court involving wisdom. And it wouldn't surprise us to learn that a lot of this were put together during this time. Some of it might have been written a little bit earlier, and that it was picked up by the people in Solomon's court. But what we do find that is rather consistent is that in the Yahweh Source, it's always going to be concerned with things that have taken place in Judah or in Hebron or in the southern part of Palestine. The Yahweh Source was written sometimes later. I'll talk a little bit about when this might have been. This 750 BC, does it ring a bell? How many know what 722 BC is? 722 BC is when Samaria fell to the Assyrians, when the northern tribes were taken into captivity. And one of the theories is that people that were in the north could see the oncoming slaughter that they were going to undergo with the Assyrians, and a lot of them fled down into Judah to get away from there, get away from the Assyrians. And when they were down in Judah, they found out the people in Judah had this Yahweh. Why don't we get our background? And so they did the same thing, and they wrote the Yahweh Source, which talks mainly about things that are pertinent to things that concern the northern tribes, things that involve Ephraim and Manasseh and Reuben, some of the other tribes that were not a part of Judah. They show up in this in the Elohim. The priestly source, I found out anybody can have any choice what they want. There are people that say it was written as far back as Hezekiah. Most people sort of lean to the idea that the priestly source was not actually put together until the Israelites were in Babylon, having been captured by the Babylonians and were in exile, either shortly before they went to Babylon or while they were actually in captivity itself, or maybe shortly after the first time they got back. In other words, it's much later than the others. Next week, we're going to look at this a little bit more carefully and find out there are a lot of subtleties in the Elohis and the Yahwehs and the priestly documents that tell us something rather interesting. Not only the stories that are in those documents, but something about who wrote them, why they were written, when they were written, why they were written, and probably how they were written. In other words, we can learn almost as much about what was going on in Israel at that time from the way the documents are presented to us than we can just from the stories that are in the documents themselves. And that's what I want to look into next week, is what we can learn from about when these documents might have been written that tell us something about the people that wrote them. 50 minutes is up.